Welcome to the second episode in a Legendarium series about the awful truth about fairy tales. Today we'll be talking about Snow White. We'll discuss the story that we know, the role that the Brothers Grimm played in preserving it, how Snow White went from medieval to modern and why the story changed, and finally we'll see if there was a real Snow White. The story of Snow White is well known to most people today, mainly from the 1937 film adaptation. Our modern version is a simple story of good against evil, with a cautionary tale against vanity. It tells the story of a beautiful princess described as having lips as red as a rose, hair blacker than ebony, and skin whiter than snow. However, she lives under a wicked stepmother who is obsessed with being the most beautiful woman in the land, and she also happens to be a witch. The Witch Queen asks a magic mirror every day who the fairest in the land is, and as long as the queen is told that she is the fairest in the land, Snow White is safe. But once the mirror tells the queen that Snow White is more beautiful than her, the queen orders her huntsman to murder Snow White. Unable to do so, the huntsman urges Snow White to flee into the forest, where she stays with 7 dwarves after cleaning their house for them. The 7 dwarves and 1 woman live happily together until the Witch Queen learns from her magic mirror that Snow White is still alive and that she is still not the fairest in the land. The queen arrives in disguise with a poisoned apple and tricks Snow White into taking a bite of it. This causes Snow White to fall into a death-like sleep, and the dwarfs place her in a glass coffin kept above ground. And she remains in that state until a handsome prince comes by, kisses her, and then she wakes up to report for her happily ever after. Not surprisingly, much changed in the story of Snow White from the medieval to modern era. Snow White and many other stories circulated throughout Europe until the 1800s when Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm wrote them down. And they weren't just authors, but folklorists who wished to preserve German culture during an especially trying time. At the time, Germany was occupied by Napoleonic France, and the Brothers Grimm wanted to remind the Germans that they were the heirs to a distinct cultural heritage that was worth fighting for against their French rulers. And in the year 1812, the year of Napoleon's invasion of Russia, the Grimm brothers published their collection of German stories as nursery and household tales. The stories they originally published were, pardon the pun, much grimmer than what we know today. Indeed, these stories were not written for children. They were meant to teach harsh morals to grown-ups, and they were filled with violence and witchcraft. Now, the first major difference between modern and medieval Snow White is that the Wicked Queen does not only order the huntsman to murder Snow White, but to cut out her lungs and liver. Of course, the huntsman refuses, and instead kills a boar, cutting out its lungs and liver to deliver to the queen. Upon receiving the grisly trophies, the Wicked Queen boils the organs with salt and eats them. Then as now, cannibalism was a horrific taboo, seen as something only done by the worst of people. And it's important to note that when the story of Snow White first began to circulate, probably in the 14 or the 1500s, the fear of witches was very deep both in Germany and across Europe. Indeed, in Germany, thousands of women would be forced into confessing to witchcraft, often after torture that involved the rack and thumb screws and sometimes even red-hot irons. Now, while the 1937 film version only shows us the queen trying to kill Snow White with a poisoned apple, the queen makes 3 such attempts in the original fairy tale. First, she tries to convince Snow White to try on a corset, with enchanted strings that pull so tight they strangle Snow White, and the dwarfs save her by cutting the laces. In her second attempt, the witch disguises herself as a peddler and sells Snow White a poisonous comb, and when Snow White tries to comb her hair with it, she passes out. Again, the dwarfs save her by removing the comb. And during the witch's third attempt with the poisoned apple, Snow White takes a bite of the poisoned apple, it wedges in her throat, and she goes into her death-like sleep. Now, you've probably noticed by now that Snow White seems like an extraordinarily weak and naive character by modern standards, and there is a reason for that. Remember, women back then were expected to confine themselves to the house, their families, and to their churches. The idea of an independent woman was deeply frightening frightening to many Europeans at the time. Indeed, independent women were often associated with witchcraft, and that is the reason why the extremely weak and passive Snow White is seen as a good role model, and the Wicked Queen, an independent woman who has great power, is seen as deeply threatening to society. Now, this shows us just how much the world has changed since the 1500s. Now, moving on to another difference. As in the modern version, the dwarfs put Snow White into a glass coffin, and when the prince comes by on a hunt through the forest, he insists on taking the dead girl with him, much taken by her beauty. The dwarfs do not wish to part with Snow White, but they are afraid of getting into an argument with a prince. So the dwarfs haul her coffin out the door, one of them stumbles, and the apple wedge is accidentally knocked out of Snow White's throat, and she wakes up. The prince and the Snow White, rather abruptly, fall in love and make plans to get married. And when the prince and Snow White get married, the Witch Queen arrives in attendance. But once Snow White recognizes the queen and tells the prince of her nefarious deeds, the prince forces the queen to put on a pair of red-hot iron shoes and then dance until she falls down dead. An exceptionally brutal ending to this fairy tale. Now, this version of Snow White comes to us from the 7th edition of Grimm's Fairy Tales, written in 1857. Now, in 1812, the Brothers Grimm were political agitators, trying to teach Germans about their Germanness so they would be more willing to go and drive out the French occupation. However, by 1857, the Grimm brothers had become businessmen, and they were selling their books to middle-class audiences who wanted to teach their children good morals. And there's a couple of small but telling changes they made between 1812 and 1815. First of all, in the 1812 version, the Wicked Queen is not Snow White's stepmother, but her biological mother. And this makes her crime even more monstrous and her obsessive vanity all the more terrifying. In addition, the apple wedge in Snow White's throat is removed when one of the prince's servants, angered at carrying around a coffin through the woods, hits the side of the coffin and accidentally dislodges it. Now, why were these small changes made? Well, they were made with the Grimm brothers' middle-class audience in mind. First of all, they did not want to upset middle-class readers by putting a mother in such a negative light, and they definitely did not want to show servants being disrespectful to their masters. Now, there is a popular belief that folklore often originates with actual persons, and scholars of folklore have found a real young woman whose life story does bear some parallels to those told of Snow White. Some researchers think that the inspiration for Snow White may have been Marguerite von Waldeck, a German countess born in 1533. Her mother died when she was young, and her father married a woman whom she frequently quarreled with. In time, Marguerite's stepmother, Katharina von Hatzfeld, forced Marguerite to move to the city of Brussels, and there she fell in love with a Spanish prince named Philip, who would go on to become King Philip II of Spain. Both Marguerite's father and stepmother strongly disapproved of such a match, in large part because Philip was Catholic and they were Protestants. Not long afterwards, Marguerite died very suddenly, and many of those around her suspected poison. It was even rumored that her stepmother may have slipped poison to her to prevent the match from going through. So we do have a few parallels. We have a wealthy young woman dying very early in life and a wicked stepmother. But where could the dwarves come into the story? Well, the von Waldeck family had a dark secret. The family owned a number of copper mines in Germany that were worked by children effectively held by the Waldecks as slaves. Many of these child miners had severely stunted growth and deformed limbs from working in cramped conditions and not getting enough food. Indeed, some of these child workers wore brightly colored cloaks, much like how the dwarves are often portrayed. However, these bright cloaks were not worn for fanciful reasons, but so the child laborers could be easily identified if they died in the mines. So, was Marguerite von Waldeck the real Snow White, and the child slaves of Waldeck the real dwarves? Well, We don't know for sure. But that's what helps to make folklore so fascinating. And if you're interested in learning more about medieval fairy tales, check out my book on Amazon Kindle, The Terrible Truth About Fairy Tales. Just use the link in the description. And that wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, please let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great day.